Hello everyone, and welcome to the 43rd episode of TechLifeSkills with Tanmay. My name is Tanmay Bakshi, and as you might know, one of my favorite things to do is to travel. Now, of course, due to the pandemic, traveling is definitely not something anybody should be doing, at least in most parts of the world. But what if I told you that despite this pandemic, of all the people that I've met, some of them doing the most interesting work and really innovating during this time are actually doing so in the field of travel. That's right. So today we're going to be diving into artificial intelligence, data, robotics, predictive modeling, so much more, and how they all tie back into the world of travel, tourism, sightseeing, and more. Now, of course, there's the more sort of obvious impact that this technology has, like, for example, with autonomous vehicles, which is the kind of stuff that everybody looks at. But then from there, we also have to ask questions like, how exactly can organizations engineer the experiences that people actually have with those autonomous vehicles? And so that's the kind of stuff that we're going to get to dive into today. Now, before we begin, one more thing I do quickly want to say is I do see on the live stream chat one of our viewers, Shiva. It's her dad's birthday, so happy birthday to him. I'm sure everyone's going to join me in wishing him a very happy birthday. Thank you very much for joining today, Shiva. And so today, of course, our special guests talking about technology in travel are Alex Bainbridge, the CEO and CTO of Autoura, and Marjorie Perlas, the CEO of Scapade. Now, of course, instead of me, trying to introduce all the different amazing stuff that they work on, I think it would be great to hear it from them directly. And so, without any further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Alex and Marjorie to the show.
It's great to be here. So my name's Alex. I'm a developer at heart. I think I've got about 20 years writing code behind me. Been looking for the next big challenge. What is the next big tech thing that's going to happen that I can apply my skills to? And it is of course, autonomous vehicles. So I look forward to talking a bit more about that.
That's wonderful to
today.
hear. Thank you for sharing that, Alex. It's I gotta say, I'm a developer at heart as well, and so I can't wait to see what kind of technology you're working on. And of course, Marjorie, I'd love to know a little bit more about you as well.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Marjorie, the founder of Scapade. I am launching a mobile travel app that connects people based on shared interests and promotes more meaningful cultural experiences. I am not a developer at heart. I'm a little bit more on the dreamer side, but I love technology and I love the ways that we can find that we can bring the needs of the millions in technology together.
That's very nice. I know we were talking a little bit beforehand, and one of the questions that we were talking about is how you actually choose what projects to focus on. And this is something I do want to get a little bit more sort of insight into, and I'd also sort of alluded to this in the videos that I uploaded before the actual episode, as to the kinds of wild ideas that you come up with, and I'd love to sort of hear more about that. So how about we start off with you, Marjorie, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Alex. How exactly do you choose what projects it is that you want to focus on in the first place? Because I know you're working on so much, and I also want to get on to what it is that you're working on. But first of all, how do you choose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for myself, I need to have a passion for kind of what it solves. What does the product solve? Which is kind of something that we all know as product people, how that works. But most of all, I love a challenge. So even if it might not seem completely possible, I love it just trying to find a workaround. My favorite word is workaround or work through, right? How do we get to it? There must be a way we can get to it. If the technology doesn't exist, how do we create it? So that has always been kind of what gets me excited about new projects.
I gotta say, that's what's so nice about working with technology is if something doesn't exist, you have the capability to go ahead and create it, right? Go ahead and actually invent it and actually make it exist. And that's why I love being a developer so much. But of course, Marjorie, without folks like you actually coming up with these wild ideas and having us developers work on creating this new technology, we wouldn't have that direction. And I know, Alex, you're sort of at that intersection. So what about you? What's your opinion?
Yeah, so I kind of have two key principles for when I sort of choose what I'm going to do next. Obviously, I'm a sort of an entrepreneurial type person, so I need to think about it as a startup rather than just as a problem. But the first sort of key principle is to look at some external change. So if you look at the majority of tech within the travel industry, it is either there because of the web, because of mobile, or because of social. So you look at these external changes in technology and work out how that has changed and how that applies to the travel industry. And my reckoning, of course, is that the next one in that list is autonomous vehicles. But my sort of second key principle, which is more of a startup principle rather than a sort of a technology principle, is to choose something that's actually quite hard, that will take about 36 months to achieve. Because if it takes less time than that, your competition will be able to recreate what you have done very quickly. If it takes longer than that, you'll run out of money before you achieve it. So you have to kind of find this balance halfway between the two of something that is sufficiently impossible that firstly, very few people want to bother doing it. And secondly, they're gonna give up before they get there.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it, I will say. I mean, there's so many problems I can think of that sort of fall within that description. I mean, I know that quite a few of the projects that I work on, I usually open source them. And a lot of these projects are ones that I will work on for, a very long time. Like, for example, the first sort of project that really interested me in machine learning was watching Watson play Jeopardy. And ever since then, I've been so fascinated by just like question answering systems, because I feel like those are like almost like a sort of flagship machine learning use case in a way, almost, because there's so much that you can do with a question answering system, and not even just the QA, but even the components that come out of that system. There's so much you can do with them, right? And so even today, I'm still working on like open source, QA systems and natural language processing technology, and so that does make sense. You want to choose something that is sufficiently complex enough that not everybody can do it. Otherwise, it's either A, already been done or easy for someone else to replicate, or
you want to be competing against the problem. That's your competition. The competition is the problem, not the competition is the 500 VC-backed startups who've all got the same idea.
Very nice. You want to be competing against the problem. I like that a lot. Wonderful. All right. So now we did talk about some pretty interesting insights into how you choose what to work on. But before we actually get into what you're working on today, I do want to know a little bit more about how you actually got to being Alex, the CEO and CTO of Autoura, and Marjorie, the CEO of Scapade. How did you get to doing what it is that you're doing today? And could you maybe also share a little bit more about what it is that your companies actually work on as well? So Alex, let's start off with you maybe.
Yeah, I started writing code when I was about 10, which considering I'm now in my mid-40s is quite a long time ago. And my very first program that I wrote was a stock exchange management game for a VIC-20 and Commodore 64. So this is like early 1980s. So I've kind of been doing these kind of data systems for what appears like rather a long time. I've got a degree in computer science. I then worked in the travel industry, actually more on the project management side rather than development side, in the early 2000s with a lot of the big web and e-commerce projects that were taking place at the time. And then I set up a business called Tour CMS, which was the early leader in tours and activities, data management. And that was a very successful business in its sector. And I sold that 2015, 2016. So really for the last few years, I've been working on what comes next. So that's I'm a bit of a veteran, I guess, but still young enough to be writing code on a daily basis, which is a good place to be.
Gotta say, that's absolutely fun. I know so many developers that are so passionate about writing code, but then once they go into that sort of like startup or entrepreneurial sort of area, then they have to stop writing code and focus more on like managing different things. So
I actually went backwards. So I was a senior manager in technology, and it was only when I started doing my own startup that I looked at all these developer salaries and I was like, oh, I can't afford any of those. I was like, oh goodness, I did once know how to write code. I'm going to have to start writing code again. So I've gone backwards. So I've actually had that senior management position without writing code and without managing technology. And I've gone back to writing code because it just gets my ideas executed the way I want to execute them, which is the key thing. Really.
Very nice. And I assume you also enjoy it more as well, right?
Well, it's been great for the last 12 months because we've not had any customers. So we've just been able to write code. Normally you have to write code and scale and deal with customers. Whereas the last 12 months, it's been like, oh, we're just writing code. This is great.
That's very nice. Yeah, getting to finally sit down and write some code and solve some
I
problems.
wouldn't just say, it's quite nice sometimes to have a bit of feedback though.
Yeah. Now. All right, there we go. I think our technical issues should be figured out, everybody. I'm very sorry for the technical difficulties, but we are back. So now, luckily, the streaming software is not saying the encoder's overloaded, but I'm not going to bore you with the details. Back to you, Marjorie. Again, picking up exactly where we left off. You know, how did you get to where you are today, and so what sort of led you to become the CEO of Scapade, and what kind of work do you do?
Yeah, I think growing up in the millennial kind of group, there was always, I've always been excited about technology. You know, we came up with MySpace and, you know, HTML right after school for 3 hours, whether you were technical or not. So I've always been passionate about technology and just really excited about what it can do. And I've always been passionate about travel. And then at one point, many years ago, I ended up working at Fila on their e-commerce team and really kind of jumped into technology and working directly with developers and project management, just kind of across the board back when people didn't think you would order clothes online ever. So it's been a while. After that, I worked with a few startups and some other travel companies, working in project management, branding, sort of across the board. And I always knew I wanted to have my own project. I knew I always wanted to solve an issue in travel that I myself experienced. And that is how I came up with the concept of Scapade. I did a 1-month sort of founder tech boot camp in Nice a few years ago to kind of jump in and say, okay, how do you get a product from ideation to pitching it to VCs? So that was a really great kind of course for me to figure out how to go about doing those things. And here I am taking practice into action.
That's very nice to hear, finally being able to, you know, actually apply these different ideas that you've had from personal experience. And I do want to dive a little bit deeper into that, but first of all, there is a question that, you know, I've been curious about, and also Tassin asked in the live stream chat. Also, it's also Tassin's birthday today, so very happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, Tassin.
And so his question is, what will the future of travel and technology look like? So he says he'd like your thoughts on that. But before I go ahead and ask you that, though, I think what would be interesting is, before we get to his question, if we could also cover sort of what the past has looked like for travel and how that sort of intersected with technology in the past and how that intersection has grown, and then we can get to what's happening today and what we see in the future. So maybe we can start with you, Alex.
Yeah, well, I mean, the history of travel is fundamentally has been one, at least on the retail side, about having these kind of thousands of travel agents who are there to sell you your flight and your hotel before you go. And that information used to be sent by telex and then by fax to the local sort of hotelier or to the airline directly, and it was entered into some sort of historical system. And it was only really from the 1970s onwards, around that sort of same time as Telex and Fax, that you started having these global distribution systems for airlines and flights to make it easier for travel agents to do those transactions. Fundamentally, though, from a sightseeing perspective, which is the things that you do when you get to a destination, when you're in leisure travel, it's not a business travel thing, but a leisure travel thing. That was always something you went to your hotel concierge or you went to a visitor center and you kind of said, oh, what can I do tomorrow? What can I do? And it was just a local transaction. So you were booking something that was taking place about 5 miles away. So again, it was all telephone based and you didn't need any kind of international money transfer to make that transaction happening because you were paying cash to the hotel concierge. But fundamentally, where we've gone in the last 20 years is that retail flow has all become digital. So you can now book online, you can book on your mobile, and you can make changes, and all of those kind of things have massively sped up that process, because rather than booking something a couple of weeks in advance, you can now book something to do tomorrow, or you can book something to do tonight. And so all of that technology has had to be vastly improved. But where we're going next is that technology enables you to create product. And that's where the hotels and the airlines have stopped, because they can't create product digitally. Whereas in things that you do in destination, you have all of these methods of creating product that is digital only. For example, an audio tour, which is where you might go for a 1 hour walk, listening to sort of voices and, voices in your head, thinking you're mad and sort of wandering around and this is nice or not nice. But actually in the future, with these autonomous vehicles, that's where you can start creating people a 3 hour experience and say, look, hey, here's a great way to spend 3 hours in wherever you are. This is what you can do. So that's kind of where the next stage is. And that will keep us busy probably for the next 15, 20 years. And then where we go to in, a few more decades time is we're going to have these very, very fast jets. So you're going to be able to go from Europe to Australia in half an hour. Quite how that changes travel, we don't know. But that's well out of my knowledge zone. But that is certainly something to be thinking about in terms of the long term. Where's this go? Because if you can go from Europe to Australia for the weekend, well, what exactly how does one country differentiate themselves from another country? It makes it, I'll tell you something, if they've all got Starbucks and they've all got McDonald's, that is not the answer. So you definitely need that local culture to be super strong, because you will no longer be constrained by the means of transport to choose where you want to go. That could actually be a terrible thing too, because it may not be good for the planet to have the whole world going off from Europe to Australia for the weekend. So we've got a lot of thinking about that to do as well as a society.
Yeah, there's a lot of different problems to solve. And I mean, I guess from an economic and also sort of time perspective, if it only takes half an hour to go from Europe to Australia, for example, picking up off of your example, that opens up all sorts of new opportunities for how people not only live, but even work, for example, right? Imagine the sort of globalization that could sort of further come. I mean, we already do have, a much more globalized world than we did a couple of years ago, thanks to travel technology. But I mean, with that kind of technology, we can only imagine how much more integrated all these different countries will be, right? I mean, I heard of this model. I forgot what context I'd heard of it in, but a sort of future model of governance where governments have to start competing to actually offer value to get citizens, right? And I feel like that's the sort of thing that this would be able to work towards, and I think that would be advantageous for people. So go ahead.
I'm not planning on any of that happening anytime soon. But I mean, people call me crazy enough for working on autonomous vehicles, and because I'm talking about 2025, 2030, and everyone's like, oh, that's miles away. If you start talking about traveling from Europe to Australia, where that's decades away. But it is conceivable that people who are entering their careers, starting their careers now, that will happen during the course of their career. So it's a long way out, very long way out, and certainly nothing to plan against for the near or medium term.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Marjorie, sort of going back to what you mentioned, you mentioned how you come from, a time when people never thought you'd be ordering clothes online. And when you say that to me, that feels like, oh, that must have been so long ago. When you think about it, that's actually not that long ago.
Don't call out my age.
No,
Don't do it.
no.
No, for sure. I think when we talk about the future of travel, I think the number one thing that we can all agree on is that borders are going to be something that we're going to look at completely differently.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's being able to fly 1 hour to Sydney and be able to go there for the weekend, or work remotely from a different country every 3 months, or even have longer vacations because of the quarantine and because of the different requirements for travel. Borders are not going to be what we knew before, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that evolving, of course, and sort of going back to actually exactly your point, right? And also sort of tying it into what Alex mentioned about travel agents, for example, right? I remember, like, even just like 5 years ago, today I think travel agents have been mostly phased out by like digital methods of booking. I think they still exist, but very
They would
few
argue
people.
that. They would argue that. I'll tell you that.
I know, but I mean, like even like 5 years ago, I had to book like flights for like a conference, and this was one of the first sort of major events that I had done. And of course, back when I was like 11, 12, of course, my parents are helping me out with the booking and everything. And during it, my parents, were like, oh, so we should be reaching out to like a travel agent and booking. And even back then, I was like, but why not just do it digitally? Like, if we have Google Flights, if we have these, why not just fill out a form online instead of having to talk to someone? So
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I had actually heard a while ago was that travel is the last sort of frontier where people are moved by their emotions to make decisions based on their emotions more so than other sort of industries. So especially that sort of connection to your travel agent, like that's a relationship. That's not just a booking engine. That's not just a website, right? You're calling them because you trust them. And you're not going to have the same thing when you're going on Skyscanner or booking.com. So it's there's something to it. I know it's a little dated, but they are still useful to a large set of people.
There's still a place.
The key thing you have to remember is that technology doesn't make things better inherently. It can make things better, but it can also make things worse. So just because something becomes the mainstream way of doing something doesn't actually make it better. So I would argue that booking your travel online is actually worse than booking via a high street travel agent. What's different about it is that it's more convenient, you feel more in control, and it's many times cheaper. But it's certainly less personal, certainly less of an experience. So we always sort of have this discussion. I mean, I'm sort of building a tour guide that's made out of AI, and everyone's like, your AI tour guide versus these human tour guides, this is going to be terrible. And I'm like, yeah, it's going to be terrible, but I bet you we get the mainstream market, because we're going to be free, and you're trying to charge everyone $50 an hour.
Love it.
So like I said, online travel agents a factor worse than high street travel agents on a number of different ways. But it was so what happens is that you still get these travel agents who are serving the luxury market, because you always get people who want to pay for that extra service. But the mainstream market shifted to digital.
Yeah,
that's the same thing.
It's always a matter of value optimization, right? Because for some people, the extra value that they're getting from like an actual booking agent, just that extra personalization or whatever convenience that might add, maybe that's not worth the extra money. Or maybe it's actually inherently you just don't want to have to talk to someone when you book travel. Maybe you know exactly what you want and you just want to book. It's always that value optimization problem. And for the mainstream, it happened to be that the digital way of doing things was just better for them. And I love what you mentioned about how technology doesn't inherently make things better. It goes back to another episode of Tech Life Skills with Mike Tibbs, a really good friend of mine. He worked at a Fortune 1 company, and he talks about digital transformation. He hates the word digital transformation because you can transform digitally, but it could be for the better or for the worse, right? You're not specifying if you're actually adding value with digital. And what you said also leads us to a really interesting conversation about personalization and how you can actually use technologies like machine learning or AI to personalize through tech. But before we get to that, I do really quickly want to take up a question from Shiva through the live stream, asking what kind of changes has COVID brought to jobs and working methods in the tourism industry?
Yeah,
So,
I think well, I can just jump in on that. I think in the B2B perspective, when we're talking about the way that the travel industry kind of conducts within itself, it used to be face to face, right? You would go to trade shows, you would have networks. It was kind of these little small clubs of industry peers that you were always connected with, and they were all across the globe. And now we're all at home, we're sitting in front of screens, we're having Zoom calls. And I think the biggest shift for this sort of industry is to figure out how to adjust to that, how to, plan for a more virtual kind of collaboration, which is interesting. One of the things that we had talked about was kind of the intersection of tech and travel and what it looked like before the pandemic. And I would say that a lot of travel tech companies were not welcomed into the traditional model of travel or attractions or tourism as they are now, right? So I would have one colleague who was working in tech had a really great solution for maybe a hotel or an attraction. They would present it, and the person managing that would just be like, I don't really understand. I'm not sure if it's for, even though the solution is pretty clear and it works and it makes sense and they have the budget for it, but there was no sort of cohesiveness with travel tech and the traditional travel industry. And now attractions, hotels are scrambling to do, paperless ticketing, paperless everything, create their own mobile apps. And the thing is, the solutions are already there, which is great. So all they have to do is reach out to these companies that have been working on it for years. So I think that, that's going to be the biggest shift, to kind of bring those two industries together and just make it better overall. The pieces are there. We just need to bring them together.
Yes.
I mean, I like the end of conferences. If you look at sightseeing industry, it's approximately 200,000 companies all over the world. Every single local town will have a tour guide company or a sightseeing bus company or whatever it is. And out of those 200,000 plus companies, probably 750 used to go to conferences. The other 199,000 didn't, because they couldn't afford to. And those conferences took place in the USA, or they took place in Berlin, or they took place in London. And you just weren't going to go there if you were a local company in a place that wasn't, was on a sort of a different economic kind of level. So we've now got the world, so we can now address those 200,000 companies. That's fantastic, and and everyone is thinking about that. That is, we should not go back to running conferences for the top 500 companies.
Yeah,
we should be thinking, actually, you know what? We want these 200,000 companies to be involved somehow. How do we get those 200,000 companies involved?
Yeah, actually getting everybody to work together. That's a good point, and that's something that COVID is almost enabled.
I wouldn't say they're working together.
Okay, yeah.
This is like sport. This is like sport, right? So you don't necessarily have to work together, but you all do have to agree that you're playing the same rules. But once you've agreed that you're playing football, you compete as strongly as you can. So it's not actually collaboration. The only extent of the collaboration that's required is to collaborate on, this is how we're going to run our business. This is good practice. This is bad practice. We don't actually need people to be, partnering up and doing collaborations everywhere. That's not actually that necessary, but you do have to agree on the ground rules.
Exactly. The
I
wording
think
there.
the beauty of the travel industry is that there's enough room for everyone. It's a huge market, and there's so many players in it, but there is enough room for everyone. And I think that that's the one thing that we need to always keep in mind. So whether you're competing, whether you are collaborating against Alex's better judgment, there's always going to be opportunities. So new products, traditional sort of businesses can all kind of play football together, and we will all succeed in the end if we, like Alex said, agree to what we're playing.
No, you see, well, I do disagree slightly with that, Marjorie. I think that that's how it has worked up to this point, because there is inherent friction because it's a global travel industry. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard for me as a British company to sign up a company in XYZ country without having a relationship with them in some way. But actually, we're moving away. We're moving away from that friction because digital is taking those layers of friction away. So if you think about the early sort of travel agents, when you might have had 30,000 travel agents retailing an individual property, and then we went to the OTAs and online travel agents, and at one point there was 30 good ones that would send you bookings, and we're now down to 5 or 3 or maybe even only 2 if you think about Booking Holdings and Airbnb and others. The friction is gone. So actually digital removes the friction. So it potentially can be winner takes all. It doesn't. The friction has been stopping the industry becoming winner takes all, but by removing the friction, it increases the chance that it is winner takes all, and that's when it becomes a little bit more cutthroat because you have to be in that game. Certainly, all the VC money is going into companies on the that many markets will become winner takes all.
I do agree. I think to add to that, I think that we're in a moment of seeing how people are reflecting on how their money is being spent, where their kind of labor is going into, and you are seeing a kind of shift in traveler behavior of not necessarily wanting to book the easiest thing, and kind of trying to figure out, okay, what is a more sustainable alternative? What is the local business that I can support, versus just booking what's convenient, right? So convenience was for when the booking platforms just came out and a little bit after, but I think we're seeing a little bit more of accountability from the traveler's perspective. So one of the things that I would say is how do we kind of lean into that, and how do we allow them to be accountable, to be responsible, but also do it, using digital tools and offering these sort of technologies for people to discover places on their own without having to resort to, only Airbnb or only Booking.
I mean, that comes on to there's a massive change in sort of consumer knowledge on sustainability that is taking place. So, for example, in the last few weeks, just before Christmas, I called for the end of diesel and petrol-based sightseeing by 2030. So you will not be able to take a bus tour or on a 4x4 ride or whatever it is after 2030 on a petrol or diesel-based vehicle, because we as a collective society should be going, well, that's a sensible idea. But it turns out that that's the same sort of timeline that electric cars are going to be mandated for sale within the EU. So it's around that timeline, consumers are going to go, do you know what? If I've got a choice of an electric bus or a diesel bus when I'm in my destination, I'm going to choose the electric bus. So it's the consumer behavior that drives the change. Exactly. And I think that is where, I think that's going to be what's really very interesting over the coming handful of years, is watching how that consumer behavior sort of impacts on what we as a travel industry provide those people.
I mean, speaking of consumer behavior, I mean, we were actually just sort of getting to before we started answering Shiva's question, the sort of personalization that consumers are starting to expect. I mean, for example, we had an episode of Tech Life Skills with David Kenny, who is the CEO of Nielsen Holdings, and of course, Nielsen being the large sort of media company that they are, he was talking a lot about how consumers are starting to expect pretty much everything, including their media, of course, to be incredibly personalized to them. And it kind of makes sense because if you look at technology, there are a couple of key companies that basically control, I would say, almost all of the technology that we use, right? It's possible for someone to have quite literally like an entire Apple or Google household, right? Somewhere where the music that they listen to, the shows that they watch, the videos that they consume, the podcasts, the audiobooks, the way they control their lights in their home, their cars, everything can be controlled by a single company, essentially, right? And so what that has enabled those key companies to do is collect so much data from you, from basically everything that you do, to essentially hyper-personalize everything, which is, again, the value, I guess, in a way, for those consumers.
But
so where do you see that intersection travel?
No? It's not, is it? It's not. No.
Okay.
People think they're personalizing.
Well,
These big companies think they're personalizing.
Working towards.
I mean, you take an example like Netflix or something like that. Amazon Prime, and you say you're personalizing it. Well, okay, so you're personalizing the discovery. Mm-hmm. You're saying, hey, you should watch these 10 films because people like you might find them interesting. Mm-hmm. They're potentially personalizing the cover art. So maybe the people have uploaded, or the administrators have uploaded 10 different versions of the cover art, and different demographics get different cover art. Mm-hmm. But the film is the same. The film is the same. There is no personalization. It's only personalized retail. It's not personalized delivery. So all of these people who go on about personalization, they're not personalizing. All they're doing is trying to match. They're all advertising agency people, and all they care about is making their adverts work. And also, all they do is they line they want to know enough about what you're going to buy, mm-hmm. But they don't actually, do they? So, for example, if you go to a recipe website, does the recipe change because it knows who you are? It says, Tanmay, I know you like almonds. I'm not only going to show you these almond recipes, but I'm going to show you how to add almonds to chicken or something, right? Okay, because it knows that. No, it's the same recipes. Everyone gets the same recipes. It's just discovery that's personalized. Uh-huh. So there's a long way to go on personalization. We're nowhere near it. Nowhere near it.
I love that take of personalization, I gotta say. I mean, actually, yeah. Sorry, just to sort of interrupt there. One thing that I do want to mention is, that sort of opened my eyes up to, a new way of thinking about personalization in a way, what we view today as personalization is just a fraction, not even a fraction of what its true potential is in the future. And I feel like a great example maybe is sort of like to sort of show the difference. Recently, there was a project I was working on, which I had presented at an IBM event recently called The Human Code. And, a couple thousand people joined this event, and sort of the idea of the event was to show the intersection between art and computer science. And this project I was worked on was essentially augmenting songwriters using neural networks to help them write more effectively, right? So being able to have songwriters feed in content and have the network automatically generate, thousands of additional verses or courses or whatever to sort of help them. Sort of automated inspiration in a way. And I was, of course, doing like a lot of research into previous techniques and attempts at doing this sort of thing. And I'd seen a paper from a university where they were trying to generate rap lyrics, which in and of itself is an entirely different challenge. My network focuses on pop. So the way that paper worked was what they did was, instead of generating lines, they trained a system to predict what lines come after other lines. And then they took basically, X number of thousand songs from Genius, and they took all the lines, and instead of generating new lines, they would just recompose the same lines from the data set from different songs into new sections, which does make sense. That could help in terms of inspiration for artists. But I don't imagine that you would want to, take lines from songs that already exist and sort of glue them together into a new order for your own song. And
Yeah, I
so,
mean,
sort of that difference between, just as you mentioned, just personalizing the cover art or the discovery versus actually personalizing the film to the individual, sort of similar analogy, I guess.
yeah, I mean, in travel, we've tried that. By joining up. And over the last 10 years, there was a big flurry of services which were referred to as trip planning or travel planning. So you would say, oh, you should go to the museum, and then 50% of the people who go to the museum then go to this restaurant. And, so how do you actually create a trip out of, but the big challenge fundamentally that you get with that is that there just is not enough travel data. So consumers, apart from people in the travel industry and apart from people in a pandemic, tend to only travel twice a year, right? So you're just not going to learn enough about someone's individual habits to be able to put that together in a really sensible way. And that's actually one of the reasons why sort of the best travel companies are not actually travel companies. So you look at something like OpenTable or Uber, OpenTable being restaurant booking, Uber being obviously, the way I refer to it as sort of grand transport or taxis. These are 52 week of the year companies. So you can use that company when you're in your home location as well as when you're traveling. So they learn enough about you because it becomes a habit and because you're always using Uber, so that when you're in some foreign city, it's going to be able to present you something quite sensible. The problem with a lot of these travel planning and all these other sort of algorithmic approaches is that humans, apart from sort of executives at larger companies and people in the travel industry, they just don't travel. And therefore, no. So what you end up with is you end up biasing the algorithm not to what is memorable, but you bias to what is possible, or you bias to what is popular. And biasing towards popular is when you go to Barcelona and it said, you know what, you should go to McDonald's, and you're like, I've not come to Barcelona to go to McDonald's. But that is what that's biasing for popularity, and that is what accidentally happens, is because these algorithms are informed by data, and the data says, well, hundreds of thousands of people go to this restaurant, it must be good, right? Well, no, it's not. So I'm not that into it. I think you have to not use algorithms for that.
I think I agree with the personalization aspect of it, of what Alex said. We're still not there in terms of what personalization really means. What's happening right now with these travel platforms, with these sort of itinerary suggestion apps, is that it's taking assumptions, doing A/B testing, and creating a curated sort of profile, curated feed for that person, but it's still not personalized. If we look at how, traditionally personalization works, a family comes into a hotel that they're visiting in New York, they go to the concierge, they say, we want to go to a restaurant after the theater, we are allergic, this one is allergic to this one is allergic to that, and he doesn't like tomatoes, right? And it's the concierge's job to take all of that data, mix it up together, and come up with something that they're going to enjoy and come back and say, hey, thanks for recommending that restaurant. So how do we replicate that on a digital scale? And the thing with Scapade is that we're not, to Alex's point, we're not targeted to everyone who travels. So not those people who are going on 1 or 2 trips a year. We're targeted to people who are living abroad or, traveling every 3 months and spending a really long time in one destination. And this is the kind of user that you want for this kind of data, because they're willing to share where they've been, what they like, they know how they like to travel. So they're able to create that sort of profile for you, offer up that data freely, because I think that everyone wants to have a personalized experience, but which is hard to get the information. So at Scapade, that's what we're trying to kind of, collect, for lack of better terms.
Those kind of customers that you just described, and also kind of travelers who are, for example, doing 1 year overseas as part of their university are exactly the kind of really interesting data sets. And the reason why, for example, sort of the international students are very interesting is because in the first month that someone is in that country, their behavior that they're exhibiting will be the tourist behavior. Mm-hmm. And then after month six, they've become a local. So they're having local behavior. And so you can, if you have enough international students, the data set of enough international students, you can see the transition from tourist behavior to local behavior. And that's very helpful because then you can begin to personalize based on that knowledge. So.
Right, exactly.
And actually, it's interesting to think about because you mentioned like these people that do travel a lot and being able to collect a lot of data from them. And also, Alex, I gotta say, you're really calling me out, despite the fact that I wasn't recommended this by any application. Basically, everywhere I travel, McDonald's is usually the first place I go. But
no.
Standardization. No. But still, though, no. So you mentioned the kind of consumer that travels a lot and being able to actually like understand the sort of behavior and look at their data over time. I think another thing that's interesting is also then, being able to take new technologies like deep learning and these things that are starting to become really useful and start to say, can we somehow garner some kind of insight from someone's life apart from just their travel data, things like their social media data or where they go or their interests or their hobbies or what they buy on Amazon or whatever, and use that to personalize their travel, right? Like if I was telling, like if I was talking to a chatbot, like an automated little AI-based booking agent, and I was like, I want to visit the West Coast or somewhere near the West Coast of the U.S., then how would it determine if I would rather go to the Grand Canyon in Nevada or the Computer History Museum in California, right? I would prefer to go maybe to the Computer History Museum, depending on what I've done before, but based off my interests. But if it knows that I've already done that through my social media, maybe it'll recommend something else, right? So being able to not just garner insight from someone who barely has any travel data, but also from other parts of their life, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, so absolutely. we're not using AI for discovery at all because that whole thing is just, it's been tried by people who are very clever at working out this, and the main outcome of it has all been that people just don't travel enough. Right. So I've kind of taken that learning and said, right, we're not applying AI to that problem. We're applying AI to the delivery of it. So if we know that someone doesn't drink alcohol, or if we know someone doesn't eat meat, then we can change that. We can change the delivery of that experience. And so the AI is actually on the delivery side, not on the discovery side. So I've kind of said, look, discovery, it's been a problem that everyone's wanted to address, but it's also the graveyard of many, many, many travel startups. And that's not really that's not the problem that I want to solve. So we actually have a network of freelancers, so I call them route designers, and they are the people who design the experiences using their human understanding and their human knowledge of that locality, and go, okay, this is a really good way to spend an afternoon in Vancouver. Cool. Okay, let's do that. And that's what we do. So it is much more important to have that as a good quality experience to find well in the first place. The challenge, though, is that there's 10,000 cities in the world. So if you can design one algorithm, you can get global scale in 6 months. If you start designing 1 or 2 routes in every city in the world, you could be there for 5 years doing it. But they are going to be better routes. So, better ways to spend an afternoon. So I've kind of said, look, we're going to do it the brute force way. We're going to get humans designing ways to spend afternoon, because humans are better at creating experiences for other humans.
That makes total sense, right? Just our reasoning capabilities alone, I think, are unique to the point where, yeah, it can have that extra. In fact, it does demonstrably have, that value that you're talking about. And Marjorie, would you like to add anything to that? Because there is another interesting question from the live stream that I do want to take up as well after this.
Sure. Yeah. To Alex's point, I would not want to use AI to collect the information from users. and to kind of offer up this sort of recommendation engine. We've seen that it doesn't really work, right? Not everyone likes McDonald's. And like Alex said, people are better at putting this together, right? It's going to take them a shorter amount of time. They have more of an emotional connection to the things that they're recommending versus, you know, a machine that's just kind of pulling data and statistics and saying, okay, well, you know, 30 people from your city went to this place, so you must be just like them. That's going back to sort of the personalization aspect of it. So how do we blend? And that's the thing, like there are just some things that technology can't replace, which is great, which is amazing, especially in travel. So how do we kind of blend the two? How do we, you know, the way that Alex has done it has, he's hired freelancers to kind of create these sort of tours, these roadmaps. We are also planning on having recommendations by people who have worked as concierges, right? So taking that information and using your emotions and your knowledge about a location to give a recommendation. But yeah, I think overall people aren't afraid to share their data. I think they're more so afraid that it's being collected from them. You know, it goes back to this sort of concept that we had talked about previously on how people, like the data literacy in the general population is not very high. And it's a detriment to tech because now people are fighting it. They're saying, what is Facebook doing with my information? You know, there's a whole debacle on WhatsApp now. So really, how do we create this sort of data transparency with our users, saying, okay, we are collecting your data, but here's exactly what it looks like when we collect it. Here is, you know, how we're sharing it. We're not identifying you, we're just taking statistics and we're making the experience better at the end. So showing, you know, the sort of roadmap and kind of what that looks like, I think, and for users, as you know, the reason we have so many social platforms is because people are not afraid to tell you what they like and what they don't like and where their favorite places are, right? You can just look at Instagram and no one's holding anything back. It's just a matter of not, you know, collecting it from the shadows, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Being able to have that transparency to know, you know, my data is being collected, but here's the value I'm gaining from it, or here's why it's being collected, or here's what I'm getting out of it. You know, I think that really makes consumers a lot more comfortable. Like with a company like Apple, you know, the sort of level of control they give you, and you know, even their practices are sometimes debatable, but you know, compared at least to a Google or a Facebook, being able to see the relative level of control you get over how much you share and what parts of it you share and what it's used for once you share it sort of leads to a good, which is consumers are kind of happier giving it to Apple when they do want to. But then at the same time, that also leads to a bit of a detriment because then they're not getting as much data and therefore Siri isn't as good as Google Assistant, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing, to be honest with your customers, is how you make money. That's it. If you're honest with them how you make your money, then they know. That's the most important thing. So, for example, we only make money when the customer does a transaction, a booking transaction, and we make our money from commission, which is a very old-fashioned way of making money out of customers, right? Because the customer's actually got to have taken an action, and then we get the reward from that. But you know, if you know, as the saying is, you know, if you've got a free product, then you are the product, right? Your data is the product to someone else. So we're very clear to everyone that you know, our commercial model is on the commission and the booking. But also, I think that the really key point, and this is slightly a sort of a cultural thing, that within the European Union now we've got this GDPR data requirement, and that mandates that you can access your data profile, that you can transfer it to another entity. Not necessarily the other entity can import it, but you certainly should be able to export it on the basis that you might be able to import it to somewhere else. And you should be able to have the full data set. So, you know, if that is a perceived weakness, customers are not going to give you their data because they don't know where it's going. We've turned that around and said, rather than you having to send us a data request as you need to under GDPR, here's a button and we will email you your profile now, bang, and you get it within 5 seconds. You get the entire profile in your profile in whatever in a really nice programmable JSON format. Bang. Okay. Now that's your data. What people are going to do with that, I don't know. But there it is. And that is actually a requirement of GDPR. But we've pushed it over and gone, right, we're going to over deliver on what GDPR says and do that. But I don't think that GDPR requirement has become common in the USA, Canada, outside of Europe. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for going above and beyond. Honestly, I mean, as a developer, it's so nice to hear that I can just click a button and just get all my data in JSON format. That's actually kind of. It's refreshing to hear. So now there are two questions that I want to sort of go to on slightly different topics, but I think they are interesting. One from Darshan and one from Cecily on the YouTube stream. I want to start off with one from Darshan. He's asking, is there, and I'm not sure if this is your area of expertise, but is there any impact that quantum computing or quantum physics has on transport or travel or anything? So have either of you heard of or potentially worked on something related to this?
Isn't the right answer yes, no, and maybe? Yes, no, and maybe, and all of them at the same time?
I guess that might just be the only real answer for quantum computing right now. But really though, I think it's interesting because quantum computing is in its infancy right now. And one of the things that I was actually just thinking about the other day was, and this was something that actually crossed my mind a couple days ago. We went grocery shopping, and that's something that takes a lot more time than it needs to. And the reason for that is because if you have a certain list of things that you need to get, then just in your mind, it takes effort to visualize where exactly are you going to move throughout the store exactly to get what you need in the shortest amount of steps to get out as soon as possible, right? You end up having to backtrack a lot and go to different places because you skipped it or you get something else, and it takes a lot of effort. So what was going through my mind was, what if we were to have like a 3D map of the actual store and we were able to do like a sort of like a traveling salesman optimization sort of thing, and and automatically figure out based off of what you need, this is the exact path you should take.
You've got this so wrong. You've got this so wrong. You're exactly the same as all these people trying to digitize travel agents. You're like, you started off with, we have this shop, and we're now going to digitize walking down the shop. I'm like, get rid of the shop. Don't try and optimize walking up and down the shop. Get rid of the shop.
Okay, first of all, I completely agree. But the best that I can do for today to solve the problem that I'm going to face tomorrow when I go to Walmart.
Oh, you see. Yeah. Well, that's the problem with being a tech entrepreneur, is that there's always a more interesting problem coming down the road. You'd probably make more money by solving today's problem, like how do you optimize people walking around the shop, rather than other sort of, the startup line would be, let's get rid of shops. So
honestly, from like Walmart's perspective, they probably don't want to optimize people walking across, because they want people to walk as much as possible to look at as many things and buy as many things as they can, right? That's pretty much the entire goal of grocery store design, is to make it as confusing as possible. But no,
I will argue that I would not trust just anyone to pick out my fruits and vegetables. So yeah. I don't know if I would completely digitize that solution.
Would you trust a robot? That's the question.
Only if I could have like a live feed of what it looks. I'm putting that on you, Alex. Let me know when it's ready.
That's an interesting idea,
then. So that's where we get back to our episode with Gary Marcus.
If you were a tech company and you were thinking about fruit delivery, have you got any good names as to what a tech company would be called? I mean, Apple or something would be a good name.
Huh.
Might be good. It's a great name, but an even more expensive lawsuit. But I mean, if we could create machine learning algorithms or robots that can explain why they choose certain fruits or vegetables, maybe then you'd trust them a bit more. Getting back to Gary Marcus's episode,
what I really need is the ability to be able to take a photograph of an avocado that's sat on your kitchen counter that you've already bought, and it to say you should be eating that today because you know tomorrow it's going to be off.
Does that not exist? I feel like that should exist.
That's a big problem because it's all,
The
I'm always
answer
eating
is it's
avocados
off.
one day late.
That would be an amazing application. Thank you for the idea. I should work on that.
We should do that. That could be interesting.
That would be nice.
What you do is you create a consumer website called Rate My Avocado, and what you do is you get people's photographs from their phones onto the website, and you gamify the front end so that all of these consumers go, actually, you know what, that avocado looks bad. I know that looks good, and you then get that collaborative score back to the consumer. The consumer then goes and tastes the avocado, and you find out whether or not you're right. And of course, you do that for a year, and you've got all the data you need to train your AI.
That is genuinely a good idea. I mean, you just came up with it on the fly, but I think that is exactly what we would do to build this application. So that's we have our next steps.
That's why I'm a startup entrepreneur.
I can see that. Yeah, that's nice. But also just really quickly to sort of get back to Darshan's question, the reason
that was well off topic.
A little bit, but yeah, the reason that I had sort of mentioned the whole sort of grocery store optimization thing was because, at my mind, the first thing that came to my mind there was, oh, so that's why I would want to use an IBM Q computer. And then, that sort of sunk in that, oh, I can't really do that, at least, perfectly optimally with like, I don't know, 50 things on a list or whatever, because we don't have the compute power to do it. We don't have the algorithms to do it yet. And I can imagine that with good enough quantum computers in the future that have quantum volume, not just qubits, people focus on the qubits too much, the quantum volume, the error rates, that's what really matters. When we can get that high enough, then I imagine that we could actually start to invent new algorithms to apply quantum computing to transport.
Isn't this the same debate as the 5G debate, which is that 5G in many ways is decreased latency and increased bandwidth, but not much else. And then everyone's like, yeah, but with decreased latency and increased bandwidth, we can do all these new things. So is it just an evolutionary step? Or is it just the mobile people trying to tell us that 5G actually is better than 4G significantly? So is it just more progress, or is it something really a big leap? That's the big unknown.
In between, in the sense that the mobile piece of it is, it's the next step, but the applications that it enables could be a big leap in the sense that, like, the A10X processor, for example, from Apple it in itself was just an iteration off of the A9X and the A10. But that sort of marked a new sort of almost era in computing where ARM chips suddenly matched Intel desktop class performance. And after that, now we're seeing with the M1, blowing Intel out of the water, right? So it's that incremental improvement happened to just be like, oh yeah, it's 50% faster than the previous generation, but that enabled Photoshop to start running on iPad and so many other things, right? So I think it might be in between there somewhere, right? And as a matter of fact, we actually have an entire episode on 5G with Peter Linder from Ericsson. So do check that out if you'd like to know more about 5G. I'll put a link in the description. But that's definitely an interesting parallel. But also, another question from Sacely on the live stream chat, asking, and this one's also very interesting, will governments reduce their dependence on travel, or I guess rather tourism, or will they continue to put quantity over quality as a measure of tourism success?
I don't think that the sort of support from the tourism industry is going to decrease. I think it's going to shift. I think that, a lot of the sort of consumer products that we've seen in tourism have been geared towards people who are visiting for 2 or 3 days and don't know the city. So how do we focus on creating a more meaningful sort of experience for people visiting, while also something that is an offering for locals? It's not going to be just for travelers anymore, right? So like Alex said before, in terms of travel tech, we want to create a more holistic approach, right? We want something that people can use abroad and at home. Just like Uber, just like Airbnb, it doesn't just apply to travelers anymore. So it's a more sort of sustainable model for the market. But I think overall, that's going to be super beneficial for lots of countries who kind of rely on travel for their largest source of income.
I mean, fundamentally, the problem is it always comes down to money. And in the US, and I'm not quite sure about elsewhere, but certainly in the US, many of the local tourist boards are paid as part of the bed tax that visitors will pay when they're booking a hotel. So they are motivated to increase numbers of out of city people visitors, because that is how these tourist boards, and they're called CVBs, or convention bureaus, are funded. So it's not as straightforward as just changing the way that a destination might want to change their visitor behavior, but actually you need to replace that funding in a new way. But yeah, I think I mean, if you look at markets like the Australian market this year, this will be an interesting year, because they're still going to have their international borders shut for the whole of 2021. So what exactly do the Australian market do? So we then have to pivot to leisure and pivot to local tourists. Within the USA, that's not such a massive issue, because the majority of tourism was always domestic tourism anyway. But in many countries, they were very, very reliant on international tourism, and it's the international tourism that is stopped as a result of COVID. So we are beginning to see a lot of a sort of push for all of these tourism, which historically have been international tourism focused, to be much more leisure travel, which goes back to what can we do to the people who live nearby 52 weeks of the year, rather than these international visitors who are only coming 2 weeks of the year. And I think that's where it gets quite interesting. For example, someone who lives locally will still pay to go into an attraction like a museum, but they will not hire a tour guide, for example.
And also, I would just add to that, sorry, Alex, lots of tourism boards, or I should say even the governments of different countries, are offering digital nomad visas now, post-pandemic, to bring in tourism. So you're seeing smaller countries who are reliant on tourism dollars say, okay, well, since you can't come here for 3 days, how about you come here 8 months out of the year and just work out of here? And because of this shift to remote work, that's becoming more and more possible for a lot of people. So that might be something that we're going to see replicated in different countries.
That's I mean, I don't know quite how you can. The problem is that many of the industry, people can't shift that quickly. It's you as a country can potentially, but your stock of companies who are within your destination can't shift, because often the international tourist spends more money when they're in tourism mode, and you get someone working as a digital nomad for 8 months. Yes, they will spend some money, they will visit restaurants, but they're not going to be able to replace the high spending international traveler.
That makes sense, and it'll be interesting to see how technology sort of ties back into that, right? Like, for example, what you mentioned at Marjorie around like the digital nomad visas. I think that's a really interesting sort of play on that, because actually an interesting discussion I was having with one of my friends was one of the things that I usually do when I travel is, of course I'll take my computer with me, and I'll actually do like work for example, different organizations depending on who I'm working with at the time. And one of the things that he mentioned was, well, technically you can't just work when you go to a different country, so why are you allowed to work on official work stuff when you're in a different country? And we'd done some research, and there are exemptions for like purely digital work that needs to be done on like computers, right? So it's going to be interesting how to see how technology sort of changes the law in a way to sort of fit with the new way of living, especially after the pandemic. Speaking of which, there is actually a question from Jean Turry on the live stream that I do want to talk about. Jean talked about something that I think is really interesting, and I had never heard of before, that American Airlines is now offering a wine subscription service, which I had not heard of. I'll probably Google that soon. But Jean's question is, what other changes do you foresee as COVID changes the travel landscape? So post-pandemic, what are the sort of changes that we envision?
I think I have not heard of that either, but I do know that a lot of tour operators who rely on, face-to-face interaction really kind of digitized by doing subscription boxes as well. So experiencing Greek food from the comfort of your home while maybe engaging in a virtual cooking class, or ordering your favorite bottle of wine from California without having to visit the vineyard. So we're seeing a lot of sort of experience it at home situations that aren't necessarily virtual tours or virtual classes that existed before, but obviously are more so now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, I mean, the big change was spotted last summer, and as likely has also been spotted recently for bookings for this summer within the European Union, is that people are booking 14 days rather than 7. So even just something as small as that. There have been so many other changes as well, but I mean, that's the fundamental one, because and they're also very multi-generational. Some holidays you tend to go with your family, and some you don't want to. But the bigger trips that people are now booking are multi-generational. Take your parents, take your grandparents, whatever it is. When I say take your grandparents, take your parents, they're probably taking you, which is a different way around. But that's how they would see it. It is an interesting. The multi-generational holidays are probably going to be the place to be. I'm not. I mean, I have worked in holiday retail previously, but it's not something I'm totally focused on right now. But it is an interesting shift.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, the classic multi-generational holiday that has been popular in Europe and also USA has, of course, been cruise trips. Not necessarily sure that cruise is coming back anytime soon.
Yeah, it's. It'll be interesting to see, hopefully, how quickly we can wind down the whole pandemic situation, especially with the vaccine coming in and stuff. Hopefully, we can start rolling that out at scale better. And I mean, as a matter of fact, that actually ties into even sort of like pandemic relief stuff, is logistics, which is that's sort of other part of travel, right? Which logistics has always been something that really interests me, and sort of seeing how that has to change during the pandemic, and also how we've had to be able to, I guess, in a way, scale logistics, because, for example, the vaccine, how do you even just get it shipped from one place to another based off of all of its requirements and sort of conditions that it needs to be stored under, right?
Yeah, I mean,
think, yeah.
Go on, Marjorie.
I think one of the things that we're going to be seeing for the future of travel is how important travel insurance is going to be, more so than anything else. I mean, I don't even remember the last time that I took out travel insurance, but now it's going to be even more. It's going to be even more important to kind of make sure that flights are refundable, because as we've seen, at the drop of a hat, borders could close. You could be stuck somewhere in between. I mean, it happened already to a couple of friends of mine, and they had to be sent back. So being able to kind of have that security and know that you will be taken care of if something does happen is going to be really important for anyone who travels, especially the people who only travel 2 times out of the year.
Yeah, and that reminds me of
the biggest problem we've got with sightseeing industry is that quite a lot, and I don't actually have the stat on me right a second, but quite a lot will have to be the number I come up with today, is that of local transactions are things that people do while theoretically on a business trip. So you go overseas, you go to a conference, you're going to you're going to do a factory visit, you're going to go and deliver some training or receive some training. These business trips used to be sort of extended by a day or two, and people would go, let's go and do a bit of sightseeing while we're here, because my company's boss is just, the boss has just paid for the flight and the hotel. Thank you very much. So a lot of those business trips are going to be cut. Not quite sure how that impacts on leisure yet. There's a good chance that there's a significant impact, but hasn't been sort of articulated as to what exactly that impact will be.
Yeah.
But I'm certainly expecting one. Be just interesting to see what proportion of business travel comes back, because the people who are business travelers are also the leisure travelers at the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta say, it's gonna be interesting to see, definitely, because there's all sorts of value that like virtual events and doing everything virtually for business has, including, of course, apart from even just reduced costs, just reduced overhead. Why would you need to fly out to a different city for a meeting that you could just do over Zoom, right? It's so much better. But then there's also certain things that just kind of are better to do in person, right? But that also have value virtually, right? Like, for example, we mentioned conferences and events. When things are online, it's more accessible to everybody, right? You no longer have that barrier of entry. You got to be in San Francisco or Las Vegas for this event. Now, anybody, regardless of where you are, as long as you have an internet connection, you can access it. But at the same time, when you have things in person, you have, for example, demos or things in person that you can actually interact with and touch and feel that you can't really get through a virtual event. So it really does depend, I think, on the individual circumstances. But also a question really quickly that I do want to take up from Hockey65 on the YouTube live stream, asking, and this one's not related to travel, but I will just give a quick answer to this one. When will we all have a small supercomputer in every house? I would argue in a way we already kind of do, right? With modern technology is incredibly powerful.
Everyone's got one in their pocket, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But in terms of like modern supercomputer standard, like
Right.
tens or hundreds of cores, I mean, I gotta say, we're already starting to see companies like AMD make massively multi-core systems just available to people for a couple $1,000s, which before would cost tens of thousands of dollars.
I don't understand why you need it to be so high processor. I mean, I think that if 5G increases bandwidth and decreases latency, then much of the processing is pushed off the device and into the cloud somehow.
I think it's a niche
I don't know. I don't know.
honestly.
I mean, the kind of areas that we're going to see, and this is the big debate that I'm having with tour guides, who are human tour guides, is I spend a lot of time talking about holograms, and I say, look, you're going to be a hologram in 5 years, right? So if you still want to be delivering that experience, well, these buses that you're in today are 30 seaters, and these autonomous vehicles are 5-6 seaters. Well, you can't put a tour guide in each autonomous vehicle. Mm-hmm. So what do you have instead? Well, you can have a sort of a digital assistant, which is why we've got a robot called Sarah. But also, there's going to be holograms. You could be projecting holograms. Now, at the moment, these holograms, they're pretty popular on Kickstarter, and there's a few other sort of companies that are doing some great things with holograms. But they do require quite a lot of processing. So if we do get to the point where a mobile phone device can project a hologram very nicely onto a wall or onto a surface, or even into sort of a 3D space, that will speed up, it will hasten the demise of the tour guide. Mm-hmm. Because that, and the fact that the vehicles are smaller, mm-hmm. You're still going to have the tour guide. They're still going to be required, but they will be sat in a call center, projecting themselves as a hologram. And I'm not sure that's how appealing that will be to being a tour guide. Sitting in a call center in front of a green screen, so that you can project VR yourself to people. But that's what's going to happen when we get these devices. I mean, you can see these hologram devices are already doing well on Kickstarter or elsewhere. They're coming. They're not that far away. Mm-hmm. So I'm intrigued by them, and that does require the next generation of personal sort of computing device.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta say, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of compute we actually require, to own in the future, because there's always going to be use cases, I think, that require it. Because regardless, for example, of how fast 5G really is, certain things like, for example, one everybody can relate to is like, say, gaming, right? In the amount of time that you will have sent a data packet from here to a Google Stadia server and back, in that much time, a local GPU would have rendered multiple frames. So it sort of becomes an issue of you just fundamentally need a lot of data bandwidth that you're not really going to get through 5G for some use cases. But then again, for the vast majority of people, it could be absolutely fine to have even the monstrously powerful M1s that we have today and have everything else in the cloud, which is how like Siri works, right? And Siri's not computing everything on device. You know, a large majority of the compute's actually done in the cloud. So that totally.
I have like 6 apps on my phone. I would just like to be transparent about that. So this doesn't apply to you whatsoever.
Oh dear. What you're highlighting, Tanmay, is actually one of the biggest challenges of working in autonomous vehicles. Is that we have all these companies who are very much focused on the car and the vehicle itself and the mobility, like how you get from A to B, and that's all lovely. But let's say that the true timeline is 3 to 5 to 7 years time, somewhere around that kind of line for kind of a little bit more ubiquity. Over and above the early launch cities that we're seeing today. Well, the question then is, how has consumer tech progressed? So, if you say, well, autonomous vehicles in 5 years' time, people are going to be using their own devices. Well, yeah, but what is on their own device? Does it have a hologram capability? So you have to start making educated judgments on technology that is exterior to the autonomous vehicle, because we're sitting there thinking, okay, 5 years time, should we be designing for holograms? Should we be building for that? Should we be taking that into account? And the answer is yes, we should absolutely be taking that into account.
And I will say the travel industry, I mean, I guess I could say specifically auto manufacturers don't give me all that much hope in their current state, looking at what they do. When Apple, released CarPlay a couple of years ago, they have these 2 modes, there's wired, there's wireless, and one of the sort of things that we take for granted is that phones have ports. An iPhone has a lightning port. And so a lot of car manufacturers were like, hey, we can save a little bit of money if we just don't support wireless CarPlay and we just force people to plug in. And that's what a lot of cars do today, including brand new ones. And the issue with that is that now, suddenly next year, Apple's like, oh, we might just remove the lightning port altogether and force you to do everything wirelessly. And now these car manufacturers have thousands of cars on the roads that only support wired CarPlay. And so now effectively, they won't have CarPlay. So, they really got to start thinking further out into the future and really seeing how not only their own technology is going to progress, but other technologies that consumers have access to and are using to see how that sort of ties in together and acts as a cohesive unit, because that's what users want, right? They want that integration.
I think if you look at what happened in airlines, they have this concept called bring your own device. So previously you would have done the in-flight entertainment, would have been all of these very heavy screens that are on every seat. But then more recently they've been, well, actually, you know what? Everyone's traveling with an iPad or an Android tablet in some way. Let's just connect those. It increases the security burden, but it does actually enable the consumer to use their own device they're happy about, and it doesn't mean that the airline has to put 300 screens on every flight, even if only 50 are actually using them. Yeah. So the assumption has to be going forwards that people are going to be doing bring your own device. So that's something you have to have that assumption. So you are going to get a little bit of obsolescence around how that device connects to the car. So I'm less concerned about whether or not CarPlay is wired or not, and whether or not there's obsolescence around that, because what's more important is that we shift to the infotainment, that's what they call it in the car industry. The infotainment system is bring your own device rather than embedded within the vehicle. So, and in order to get to that point, we are going to have some obsolescence around the connectivity between the device and the car.
Right, and that's sort of, I mean, CarPlay is just an example, right? It's really the analogy to, being able to think well into the future, build for that future, and also have this kind of reverse compatibility, especially in a field like this one, I think is important.
It will be solved in the next few years because, and this is rumors only, and I've got nothing to do with it, so I'm not spreading any secrets. It's purely a rumor. But Apple is coming up with its own car and is in discussions with various car companies around that. So you will have the Apple car. So I'm pretty sure one of the one things that the Apple car will have is well, you probably won't have to turn it on its side in order to charge it. But one thing it will certainly have is a good capability to integrate with your Apple devices.
I mean, I can't wait to see that integration. Who knows? Maybe they actually are working on a card. Then again, when Apple was working on the TV and it was the Apple TV internal code name, all the rumors were like, oh, Apple's making a TV. Then they came out with a TV and it was like, oh, it's something you connect to your TV. So
well,
who knows?
If you think about the big five tech titans, you've got Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Baidu. All five have invested over a couple of billion each dollars on autonomous vehicles. They've all got into the vehicle, the tech in some way. So this is no longer, autonomous vehicles is no longer a motor manufacturer dominated industry. It is a tech titan dominated industry now. So they're all going to be doing it.
Sounds good. All right, well, that's an exciting future that I'm really looking forward to. I mean, I know we've had a really interesting discussion today. You've opened my eyes to so much to do with technology and also how it ties into travel. Quick fun note I do want to end on, though. We were talking about gaming, and I know, Alex, you're really excited about your new lights. I do like the custom color lights in the background there. An example of IoT technology we were talking about before, I guess. Control from your phone.
This is amazing.
Yep. And Marjorie, if I remember correctly, I was overhearing you and Alex speaking as I was setting up the live stream, and I think you mentioned your plant has a name.
Yes.
What's the story behind that?
This is Emilio. It was gifted to me by a neighbor who moved away, and they were from Italy. So I said, I got to think of an Italian name, and it came to me in a dream, I guess.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's nice to know that came to you in a dream. Sometimes my dreams help me debug coding problems, but
tomato.
But yeah, I mean, also, Marjorie, another fun note that I want to mention. I've been referring to you as the CEO of Scapade for the longest time here, but if you go to your LinkedIn, you'll notice you have a pretty fun designation, Chief Executive Octopus. Where did that come from?
As a solo founder, you have to juggle so many different things. And someone once, it's almost like, I need 8 arms and exactly, just to keep everything above water. So I said, this is fun. Let me go with it.
That's wonderful origin story. There's actually meaning behind it. That's nice to hear. Wonderful. All right, thank you very much for sharing. It's great to have Alex and Marjorie. Great to have you on the show, and of course Emilio. But of course, before we go today, one more thing I do want to say. What's sort of like a message that you want to leave the audience with? Maybe we can start with you, Marjorie.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we've learned and as we've talked about, this is a time for innovation in the travel industry. I think to your audience, I would say if you have an idea, if you have a product that you think could be applicable, could, change the industry for the better, go for it, build it, pitch it, right? People are more open now from the traditional model to look into tech and to explore what it can do for them. And I'm really looking forward to a more sort of sustainable future for the travel industry. Scapade, for the most part, is just connecting with people, right? And creating those meaningful memories when you're traveling abroad or when you're at home. So we want to be able to create more of that, but also be able to use technology to facilitate the process. So I'm really looking forward to, just what comes out of all of this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. And of course, Alex, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I mean, sort of my thought is that we as a travel industry and technologists within the travel industry have just spent the last 20 years basically redoing the plumbing. So you can now do all these amazing transactions. But over the next 10 years, it's about designing new jacuzzis. The plumbing is in place. We now can get creative on what you can do now all that plumbing is there. So it's all about jacuzzi design going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the infrastructure is there, and I can't wait to see what people are actually able to innovate and actually build upon that infrastructure. I think that's going to be what's interesting to see in the future. So, I mean, thank you very much, Alex and Marjorie, for joining me today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions on the live stream. If we weren't able to get to yours, and you do want us to sort of take that up, feel free to put that in the comments down below. Tag me, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you have any questions for Alex or Marjorie, feel free to let me know, and I can get them to comment on the YouTube recording. Or, of course, Alex, Marjorie, I'll put your contact detail down in the description as well. I will work with you on that. And so, once again, huge thank you to everybody for joining into the live stream today. This was a really fun discussion. We got to discuss all kinds of things that, I'm starting to think about not even just travel and technology, but even technology in general in different ways after this discussion. So I'm leaving this with a lot of different insight, and I'm sure everybody in the audience had a lot of fun as well. And so once again, huge thank you to everybody. Make sure you join us next week on Tech Life Skills, of course, every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have a really fun discussion. Can't, again, tell you too much about it just yet, but make sure you join us on Sunday. And without any further ado, thank you very much, everybody, for joining in today, and goodbye.